Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, welcome. My name is Laura Sweeney. I am the director here at Longhouse. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for bringing the sunshine. It's a beautiful day. And we are so pleased to welcome good friend of Longhouse, Alastair Gordon, for the third session in our Long Island Modern series. Alastair will be discussing Andrew Geller, the architect of happiness.
I hope.
I'm excited to learn more. Andrew Geller's work features quite prominently in Alastair's book, Weekend Utopia, which you can purchase from our gift shop on the way out.
You're sold out.
No, we've got 2 left.
No, they just sold.
Oh, we're sold out. Never mind. We need
We're
more.
shipping a box tomorrow.
Okay,
Yeah.
give us a call in a week. We'll have more. But again, we're so pleased to welcome Alastair, who really needs no introduction. Award-winning critic, curator, author, artist, writer, now filmmaker. I hope you'll tell us a little bit about your upcoming film. We're so pleased you're with us today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to be here again in this crazy weekend of weather, coming and going. This is a, thank you for coming, you guys. This is a kind of a favorite subject of all the characters that I met when I first did Weekend Utopia in the, go back to the 84, 85, 86. I'd moved back here from Europe and California and didn't know what to do. I didn't want to move back into New York City. And I just started to snoop around, behind hedgerows and things and looking for these lost little summer fantasies that my family, we had a little beach house near Devon in Amagansett, and it was tiny, and we were never happier than we were in that little house. And I guess it was a kind of visceral reaction to all the big, especially in the 80s, this sort of the new neo-historical the neo-shingle style McMansions that were just going up everywhere that had, 12 bedrooms and 40,000 square feet and huge Gatsby lawns and all this acreage. And I started to collect, started with really I'm not going to go into this because a lot of you know this already. It started with the demolition of the Motherwell house in East Hampton, which was 1985, 86. And then it was like, well, how many of these things still exist from that post-war period? How many of these little beach houses still exist? The drawing that's up here first is a drawing that Andrew gave to me after the first show. I included his work, and to me, it just symbolized everything. I mean, he never built this house. It was sort of a fantasy beach house with the husband lying, on one side and the wife pushing the cocktail cart, with gin and tonics or whatever they were to the other side. And it's just, on these pylons right on the dune in a place you could obviously never build today. And just the only writing is like ocean there and down at the bottom. And I call it architect of happiness. I think I coined this. I'm not sure. Maybe someone else did, but a long time ago. But he's one of those few kind of unusually unconventional architects who really doesn't fit into the stereotype of certainly the American architect, who's quite serious and, like Frank Lloyd Wright or Mies van der Rohe or, Charlie Gwathmey or Richard Meyer. He was very much about fun, very much kind of, against the grain. And he worked for Raymond Loewy, who was a big industrial designer for about 35 years. This is how I met him, we'll get a little personal because I did get to know him very well. And he became a real friend. This is a show I did in summer of 1987 at Guildhall called Long Island Modern. It was sort of the beginning of it all. And I had never heard of him, and I was just collecting material. No one had heard of him at that point. Or, some people had, but he'd really been forgotten. And I called him up one day, a woman in New York who I wish I could remember who she was. She said, I just had some drawings in the show, and they're really beautiful, and you should call this guy. So I called him in Northport, Long Island. He said, come by for tea. I went by for tea. His wife answered the door and said, oh my God, he's been waiting for you for 35 years. And I walked in, and it was just one room after another of these incredible drawings and models. So you can see there on the right the we included him very, very prominently in the show with his models along one wall and photographs and drawings. And it was by far, although people, knew a lot of the other work by Peter Blake and, Gordon Bunshaft and people like that, and George Nelson, they'd never heard of this guy. So it kind of became a story. And out of that, there he is. He came to the opening night at Guildhall, very happy. And there are some of his models. And then I included him in the first edition of Weekend Utopia, which was 2001. I gave him a whole chapter, in fact. And then, of course, expanded that a bit in the recent edition, which just came out this year, this summer. One of the fun things, he also kind of was instrumental in me getting my foot in the door of the New York Times, because one of the editors that I was trying to collar all year at the Times came to the opening. And I met her, and Andy was there, and I said, "This is Andrew Geller." And she said, "Oh, that's fascinating." She turned to me and said, "Write a piece for me about Andrew Geller." And that's him showing me around all over Hampton Bays. We drove around in his kind of canary yellow Mercedes-Benz. It was great. It was a convertible, and he was dressed like that in sort of a linen jacket. And we were searching for these 5 or 6 houses he had done in the 50s and 60s. We couldn't find them. They'd either been torn down or remodeled beyond recognition. And then we got to this one, the Frisbee house, which was still there. He just walks up to the door, and the Frisbee children, the parents are long dead. The children are there now living there, and they haven't touched the house in 50, 60 years. So that was fantastic. And they loved him. And they went, "Andy, how are you?" And he was like best friends. And that's very much how he was. He not only designed the houses on the weekend when he wasn't working for Raymond Loewy Corporation, and then followed through, often built them himself, not himself, but he would be serve as the contractor. So that was July 1999. That led to my first big story in the weekend section of the New York Times, In Search of Fun Among the Dunes. Very important for me and for him. And then out of that, in fact, the story that I did in the Times became the introduction to this book we did in 2003 called Beach Houses, Andrew Geller, which was the first book about him, and that I already showed you. So for about 35 years, he worked for Raymond Loewy. That's Loewy on the lower left, very kind of powerful industrial designer who was really the boss. Andrew was was very soft-spoken, self-effacing. That's him in his corporate mode there with his bald head and his cigarette, working on kind of a mass-produced affordable housing that Loewy Corporation was going to do. But he did everything from, he designed camera bodies, that Lord and Taylor. Does anyone remember Lord and Taylor? Does it still exist? Yeah, look, everybody does. Okay. So Andrew, apart from everything else, he designed shopping centers all over America. He designed department stores. When they were in the meeting with the head of Lord and Taylor, and Lord and Taylor wasn't really biting. They didn't like what they were showing them. And they said, and also we need a logo. We don't have a logo for Lord and Taylor. Andrew, apparently, this is the urban myth anyway. I think it's true. He just sat down with his pen. He had beautiful penmanship and drafting qualities. And he did that logo, the Lord and Taylor thing, which then, that's the Stamford, Connecticut Lord and Taylor above there on the right, upper right. And that's also, Andrew did the whole building. But that was his day job, his 9-to-5 job. On the weekends, he had these two kind of personas, the corporate Andrew Geller on the left, and then the kind of fun-loving. His background is worth mentioning. His father was a true socialist, come from Hungary, was an artist, but actually made his living as a sign painter. And the day, as Andrew always said, the day he was born, his father was imprisoned for radical political activity. So, my kind of guy. And he developed this, again, not this highly intellectual, serious approach to architecture, but he had such a natural flair. Those are just sketches he did for an asbestos and metal fireplace in the middle of a kind of modernist space, so that it would just be the fireplace would be there, wrapped with asbestos and sitting in the middle of the room. He signed most of his drawings with that. So that was a little mermaid that his wife had made out of stuffed. It was like a little stuffed doll, and they would hide that in the dunes for their 2 children to try to figure. So there's this whole lovely kind of family mythology that went with his work, and that became his logo. That the mermaid with the pirate. Again, he would. This is the second Hunt house where he would in Amagansett. He would just go and be on the site and very involved, and often pick up a hammer himself. And he got known when he was known in this period, mainly in the 60s. It was because of the quirkiness of the designs, and the fact that they were very small. These houses were like 600, 700, maybe up to 1,000 square feet. They cost sometimes $6,000, sometimes $12,000 was the high end. He was never published in the architecture magazine. So here he is, there's a whole spread on him in Sports Illustrated. Life magazine did several stories about him, again, as a kind of almost, whimsical, almost silly story about architecture, houses that unsquare the cube, and then had a whole story about some of his houses. His first important client was another employee at, this is Betty Reese, looking very cool in her French, fisherman's shirt on the ocean with her boy. She had a lot of boyfriends, but I can't remember this guy's name, but he had a dog. And she bought this property in Sagaponack and wanted a house. She was head of PR for Loewy, and so knew Andy very well, and she asked him for a house. She didn't have a big budget, and he literally just sat down with her at lunch in New York and sketched this out on a napkin. You can see the boat on the horizon, and that's her on a little catwalk. And then just this simple A-frame. I mean, he's credited with inventing the A-frame, but I think, cavemen invented the A-frame. I mean, I think there's always been an A-frame because it's the simplest structure, that holds itself up. And that's her Jeep that he put in there. And then he made models of it, and that's his daughter playing with or sitting with the model. That's how it was photographed when it was finished in 1956. I'm sorry, 55 actually. That's her there. Again, incredibly simple. This photograph was published in the New York Times. Again, when the New York Times wrote about him, it was never in the weekend art section. It was in the real estate section. This was a huge story in 1957. Summertime living becomes even easier at new Long Island beach cottages. And it was basically about this. And it was really the photographer who took it, and then he went to his editor, and then the same photographer did a whole series of so you don't have to go through the architectural mainstream, to get recognized. But anyway, the story was that this came out May 5th, just before the summer really got going. And the next weekend, whatever that was, apparently hundreds of cars had driven out because they saw the price, that it was so reasonable. And there's Betty Reese on what they called the Widow's Walk. That little square structure at the left there, that's her bedroom, which she had to get up to through this incredible system of this ladder that was on pulleys, something like out of Rube Goldberg. Yeah, and you kind of pulled it down, and then you pulled it up after you, so no one, if you had guests, they couldn't come up and see how you were doing as you had your afternoon nap. And then a little fireplace right beside that. That's the, if you can read plans, that's the basic plan. So you have the fireplace, and above that, this tiny little perch. Tiny, I mean, this is tiny. A bunk room behind the kitchen. You see the kitchen, and that's kind of the guest room, the only real normal bedroom in the house. And then above that were these tiny little bunk beds. And he also drew sort of ideas for how to decorate the interior, so that whole that couch there was built in and could be converted into extra beds for the weekend. That's her perch there above the fireplace. You see the ladder. So there'd be a pulley, you could just pull it down and then pull it. And he had those in a lot of the houses from this period. The other end, there was another one that led up to the, there it is, a photograph of it. And you see how incredibly small her bedroom is up there. Incredibly simply furnished. And the big idea was to have the windows on either side of the fireplace. So in the fall, when she closed it up, probably in October or something like that, but you could sit there and have a fire on a chilly night and look out at the ocean and the dunes on either side. Around the same period, he started to he started to get a name again among magazine editors. And again, it wasn't architecture or design magazines. This was for Esquire magazine. And they'd seen that house and they loved it. And they said, can you do something? I mean, it was kind of almost a joke piece for the magazine. Again, the idea was for a portable beach house for bachelors. And, it was all, the text is all, this is when it was published in May 58. And again, it was, you'd go up a ladder and pull the ladder up, once you'd found your girlfriend on the beach or whatever. And it was advertised with, it was only $3,000. And it came with a case of gin and tonic and a tiny little refrigerator. But it's a beautiful, we were trying to build this because it was never built. We wanted to build it here, and we actually had someone ready to do it. And I don't know what happened. It was one of those political things that we weren't allowed to do it for some reason. But he got very involved. Again, the socialist background he had. He was always mainly interested in the idea of, well-designed, affordable housing for, for the masses. He really thought a lot about that seriously, and he studied, what the Bauhaus architects had done and what the Russians had done, modernists had done, the futurists and modernists had done. So he was working on a series of these prefabricated. That was kind of a joke, the Esquire house, but it led to a whole series of prototypes for this kind of house. And then got a real client to try it out. I love this. This is one of my favorite sketches he did in the 1950s of a house for the Hunts on Far Island. And again, it was just the idea of taking, an elongated cube, turning it on edge for several reasons. One was, it was right on the ocean, right off the ocean beach in Far Island. So for the wind, for hurricane winds, it would become kind of aerodynamic. That lid at the top could be shut down during, nor'easters and hurricanes and stuff. But incredibly simple, incredibly small and inexpensive. So the interiors of all his houses from this period, there's no sheetrock, there didn't, as he said, to make a truly poetic house, vacation house, you don't want a basement, you don't want a furnace, you don't want all the stuff, you don't need insulation. You keep it as simple as possible. So it's just the bare, rafters and 2x4s and plywood that you see. Always there's that beach ball posed in the middle. I love this sectional. I mean, talk about Mondrian. Because during World War II, he had worked as a designer of Liberty ships, and he basically would come up with the interiors of the ships when they had to, fill them with not only troops but supplies for the war in Europe, after D-Day. So he's really good at this, and this was one end of the Hunt house, and every inch, and step had either a bunk bed on it or a closet in these kind of angular spaces. Very Mondrian, very kind of neo-objective. Right next door to Betty Reese, there was another property that Langman, who was a scenic designer, had Andy do this. They called it the Lighthouse. I mean, it was, again, this very playful, simple, very inexpensive. You can see the Betty Reese house in the background, the A-frame in the background. This they would both be washed away in another few years by a nor'easter. Again, this sort of almost caricature, whimsical, like Popeye, nautical theme that he carried into the interior, just with the bedroom. The bedroom would be open as a living room, but you just pull a curtain across it and that would become the guest room. Incredibly simple, and then louvered blinds. That's from the interior. So the same period, 1959, the end of the 50s, there was this momentary thaw in the Cold War, and Andrew played a really interesting role, kind of Cold War warrior, despite his quiet demeanor. There was this famous, I don't know if everybody knows, I mean, this should be better known. It's funny how little known it is. So there was this kind of détente in 1959, and the Soviets were going to do a trade show in New York, Columbus Circle at the old the old convention center. And they brought, they did a classic Soviet-style trade show with showing tractors and, these hefty women farming and factories and all this sort of heavy metal Soviet industry. So the USIA, the information agency, which may or may not have been a wing of the CIA, no one seems to be able to agree on that. They came up with this idea of, instead of doing like, everybody knows about American technologies, very advanced. So they wanted to do a very cultural exhibition that just showed how free Americans were. And that was the idea of the propaganda, that it would basically, sort of emphasize you could do whatever you want. The common worker in America could own not only one house, but even, a second house, a weekend house, like one of Geller's little houses. So it was this guy who's, I'm afraid, been sort of forgotten. I got to interview him for a little video I did, named Jack Macy. And he was just a brilliant guy. And he brought in George Nelson. He brought in Buckminster Fuller. He brought in Andrew Geller. He brought in Peter Blake, Julian and Barbara Nesky, all these wonderful designers, a lot of them who I've been speaking about here because they worked out here in the summers, and laid this out in Skolniki Park in Moscow. And it was so huge that the KGB had to kind of close it down and, allow only so many citizens in at a time because it was just overwhelming. Those are the American guides. And that's Bucky Fuller's gold anodized geodesic dome, which was a huge central, you can see it in the center there, the round, the circular thing. And then, talk about talent. And then you had Charles and Ray Eames doing the famous glimpses of the USA, which often you hear about in their work, but it's never put in context. So these Soviets would be allowed in. It was only a 12-minute movie, but it showed kind of life in America, the highways, the supermarkets, going to the beach, surfing, rock and roll, all that kind of stuff. And apparently the Soviet citizens were they mobbed to get in, and they were just completely overwhelmed. And this is Christian Dior. They had American fashion models wearing Christian Dior and all the other popular designers of that. Oleg Cassini was the other one I was thinking of. And they would just walk around. You can see the Russian women there looking kind of aghast at the beauty of the Christian Dior. And then the flowers. And this became almost a riot at one point when they had these fashion shows. And the women would just walk around the park. Another pavilion had just, someone turn off their phone, please. American culture at its best. This was the television pavilion, and they just looked aghast at these incredible, rows of television sets. But the most popular exhibition by far was this thing that ended up getting the name, the kind of pet name of Splitnik, because it was just a traditional kind of, almost subdivision. Yeah, it was a play on Sputnik, obviously. So Geller was given the job of, here's this house that's been given to us by Allstate Properties, which was, kind of generic development company that did a lot of houses, a lot of, not Levittown, but a lot of communities like Levittown on Long Island. And they built these standard kind of houses that were pretty boring, ugly. Geller just took one of these and basically, like Gordon Matta Clark or something, just split it in half down the middle and kind of spread it apart like a clam, opening a clamshell. And that became this exhibition that General Electric sponsored, which, to show off all their appliances and electrical stuff for the American home. And of course, the Russians who came in couldn't believe that, an average American worker could not only own this house, but have all this, the washing machines and refrigerators. And of course, it was the site. This is what makes Geller so important in the Cold War history. It was the site of the famous, kitchen debate between Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon, which was basically over, it was the weirdest argument. It was obviously politicized from both ends. But Khrushchev said, first of all, I don't believe an American worker could own this house or any of these appliances. And why do you need, there was apparently a little electric lemon squeezer. And he said, why do you need this? This is decadent. This is incredibly decadent bourgeois, which it is kind of when you think of it. Do you really need a lemon squeezer? But, it was all this stuff. And then Nixon said, yeah, it's true. And that became this kind of, ideological battle between, capitalism, Western capitalism, and Soviet-style communism. And I just think, it's funny that because Andrew he also did all the, the displays as you go in, the kitchen and the laundry room and the bedrooms and all that stuff. But out of that same company, this Allstate, they loved what he had done better than their own guy. So they basically wanted to do not for just a normal Levittown type year-round house, but some kind of, again, the idea of a second home for, middle class, even lower middle class, working class people. So they started to develop this idea of a leisure-rom, a guy, a PR guy who was good at making up names, came up with this name. And there was a site in Culloden Point, Montauk, there where they decided to build 200 of these homes. Then this was a very passionate project the architecture is by no means, incredible, but it was all about square footage and how to manage that kind of a budget. These houses were like $6,000, $7,000. The fanciest one was, I think, $10,000. They were sold through Macy's. It was all about Macy's and this development company. And you could go to the ninth floor of the big Macy's store at Herald Square in New York. And there was a full-scale model on the floor. And you could just sign up like with your credit card or whatever. You just give them and you could buy a house. And I think it was $450 down payment, and then $75 a month. And that pink sheet there, it's probably not big enough for you to read, is it? Can you read it? So you just check off what you want. Everything from how many beds, how many sheets, how many pillowcases, how many Melmac plates and silverware. And what else do they? Yeah, down to like you have 4 kids, you want 4 toothbrushes, and what color do you want the toothbrushes? So you just order the whole thing, and then whatever 6 months later, you go to the site, and there's some of the kids on the building site, and you'd get your house, and they all came with that carport, and that had a little kind of like storage unit there. So a lot of people used those or built those out and became an extra bedroom. Again, for $6,000-$7,000 to have, that was your vacation house, quite extraordinary. And the real sort of insider camp collectors look for, these are the two lower images are 2 houses that have been pretty much perfectly preserved. There are only about 2 or 3 that have been, most of them were either knocked down and rebuilt or, expanded beyond recognition. And then there's one, it may be an urban myth again, but there's apparently there was a woman there who kept everything. She had the original, I don't know about the toothbrush, but she had the original silverware, Melmac plates, everything, the towels, everything that had come from Macy's in that. So it was this kind of incredible American delirious post-war fantasy, right, to have that kind of affordability. And of course, if Khrushchev had seen this, he would have popped had a stroke probably. Again, out of this, and again, going back to his artistic sculptural roots, Geller got an amazing commission with a guy named Perlroth, who worked for the Port Authority of New York, and basically said, whatever goes. This is 600 square feet, and it's thankfully has been one of the few cases that, a family really made an effort to preserve it because it stayed in the Perlroth family. So the son got involved in it. This is it being constructed in 1958, 59, like so small, like almost like a large kite, a box kite, every inch, usable for storage. That's my favorite, that's such a classic photograph. Now it's become a very famous house. It's really probably his most famous house, and it's been published a lot. And it was, at the time, people couldn't believe it, and they thought it was some kind of, NASA spacecraft launching pad or some kind of experimental place. And again, just very, very simple. What I love is how he fit, guest bedrooms and bathrooms in the 600 square foot sculptural object with that wonderful fireplace in the middle, the striped fireplace. Again, as cheap as possible. And that staircase on the side, like kind of a lunar landing staircase, that's one of his sketches for the bathroom. And to get to that bathroom, I'll show you in a sec, you had to climb up this ladder. Again, he was into ladders. And just somehow fit. There's a shot of what it looked like in the late 50s. You had to climb up that little ladder there and that was the bathroom, and that was that tub that she was in there. This was up in there. I'm sorry, I'm pointing at my screen like a 5-year-old, who thinks you can see that. Those kids who go like this, even it's a television set, and they can't understand why they can't. So, this is, again, where his sort of genius for interior, there it is. That's a famous photograph that was published early on in the New York Times, and, again, got this enormous response. Then I say later, no one heard of him, but that's the irony of life, isn't it? He was well known for a while in this period for this kind of work, and then. So what's great about this story is that because, and again, the best thing you can do is, leave your beach house to your kids or your grandchildren and give them some money too and hope that they can do it. So this had to be moved. It was being undermined by the ocean. They were able to move it back. And then it became, again, so tiny you couldn't rent it or sell it. So a young architecture firm, what are they called? Cook Fox Architects. They did a very good job. And they turned it into a guest house, pool house. Which is kind of, that's fine. It's great. It's there. You can go see it. It's not perfect the way it had been, but you still get a good idea of what the original was like. So this is one of those sort of success stories, love stories. And the family just adores this place. And that you can, again, you can really see how complex, how convoluted the interiors were. Some of them are just amazing. And there's the bathroom on the left. Restored is kind of more or less how it originally was, with some new fixtures. And then the bunk bed, on the right. How you get up there? You have to be probably 12 years old to get in there. Then another house, same period, just a little bit later, Fire Island, the Rudy and Todd Frank house. This got published in Life magazine, a big spread. Again, it wasn't about architecture; it was more about the new American lifestyle that permitted young couples to have another house, and get away. And that was really being pushed by the U.S. government too as a propaganda tool. Like why would you turn communist if you have a beach house, right? Which is fairly good point, right? And that's Rudy or Trudy, I can't remember. Again, he has this pretty much open void, glassed in. And then this great catwalk that went through the middle of it, which I'll show you in a sec, and then came outside towards the ocean so you could sit up there and suntan and everything. And then, of course, it became famous in the 1971 because it was the site for the Boys in the Sand gay porn film. And you can see above, you never heard it? You didn't? Are you sure? A very big, apparently in the gay porn world, it was like a huge breakthrough movie, and they showed it. They loved the house because it was transparent. It was right on the on the beach, and you can see above the poster for the film, the catwalk, how it sort of went through the middle of the house, above the dining area and living room, and that he loved that kind of. Sort of almost Popeye playful, childlike kind of interior. That's it restored in 2000. Yeah, another great success story. It was one of the few. Maybe there are 5 or 6 that have been wonderfully restored. This 2007. What are the names? Yeah, Rodman Paul Architects. They basically just fixed it up, restored it, did a tiny addition. The interiors are wonderful. Fire Island, is it Davis? Wait a minute, I forget. Yeah, I can't remember. I think it's in the Pines or near the Pines. Yeah. That's the Ovid house, which is not one of my favorite houses. In the photograph of the house is not very good, but this is sort of picking up where he left off in some of the earlier projects like that Jostle house. I'm sorry, but the Langman house beside the Betty Reese house, this sort of box-like. People wanted a little more space. This is starting to get more like close to 1,000 square feet. This one is the Leonard Jossel, who was, this is Davis Park, Fire Island. And he was an artist. He was a successful artist and graphic designer. And he wanted a beach house right on the beach in Fire Island that was also big enough to be a studio for his work. Again, incredibly simple. I mean, basically like a big barn, you know. And that's his wife or girlfriend standing looking up, and she was a model of the period and committed suicide later. I mean, that's kind of a bummer. Sorry, you don't have to take that in. You can just forget about it. But again, the interior the interior was again just incredibly simple, just wood. You saw the rafters and everything, and it could be closed up in the winter. It was all these panels that close. Its own boardwalk that you approached on, went over to the ocean dunes. That's a little group of friends there around the wood-burning stove. This is one of my favorite photographs of Geller's work, because you really see it's so bohemian, and it's just plywood and 2x4s, and must have been freezing, off season, with no insulation or anything like that. And just the kind of abstract paintings of the very 50s looking beatnik paintings. I wish I knew more about this family. Apparently they were a nightmare. Andy was always so incredibly sweet about his clients, and most of them adored him, and remained friends and named their children after him and things like that. But this was a couple who was apparently really, really not very nice to each other or him. And I think the house was eventually built. It was in Old Westbury. But he apparently did hundreds. They were so difficult. They kept arguing about what they wanted. And he did hundreds and hundreds. A lot of the sketches I found when I was going through his archives were for this one house. And they didn't like any of the plans. But he ran a big hi-fi stereo company. So a lot of the drawings are these wonderful renderings of how to divide a room up, and have a big record collection, have a big stereo and television and everything. And they're wonderful. Some of these he adapted for projects at Raymond Loewy, for industrial design stuff. I love the bear rug and the butterfly chair. And again, he used that same idea of the asbestos fireplace in the center. But apparently she hated it all. The wife hated everything. And I'm not saying the guy wasn't any better, but Andy seemed to remember her midnight calls, Same period, the Lynn House in West Hampton. He started to work a lot with this idea of two structures. And again, one could be a guest house, and then the connective tissue there on the top. That connective part was where the kitchen would be. So that would be kind of a shared space. And the guests could come in for dinner, and that's it. Again, he called it the raspberry baskets because it was like squash kind of raspberry basket, where the corner would open up like a diamond shape. And that's Mrs. Lynn making, a drink or dinner for her friends. That's in the middle, that little middle section. It's very low, so the ceiling's really low. Again, all these just exposed rafters. And they would fly in by seaplane there. I guess that's Peconic Bay, right? If it's West Hampton, and all the kids lying around. I just love the patterns of the joists and everything. And that's how it worked, it's the two structures, which he used again for his friend Phil George, who was a well-known designer also at Loewy, and then became independent, had his own company that was very successful. And they had this property in Sagaponack. And again, the idea would be the main house, again, very small. And that tiny thing on the right was a guest. There you see it, not as spread out as the drawing, and with these, again, he started to use these kind of what he called fish gills, or these kind of vents in the side. You can see that. There's the sketch for the main house. Again, tiny. You can see that's the main house. And it kind of curves back like a whale or a fish. And it has the vents or the gills for the windows. That's what they look like. Again, this is another one that was, in a very interesting way, restored. Originally, he had this colored glass in them, and then It was restored by Bates Massey, which is a very good East Hampton-based firm, modernist, very, very good. This is, this is how these guys saved it. And this is about 2012. They moved the two structures, those two structures, kind of out of the way and built this courtyard type house, very low, flat roofed, single story, connected, inspired by Geller's use of boardwalks, connected by a boardwalk. And you can barely see it, but on the right is the little guest house. And then once they created that courtyard, they moved the original structures back. So they did say, they're not exactly how they were, but they did save them. And then this is at one end you go down one of these boardwalks to the very end, and that's the original main house, and that's considered tiny, of course, and that's the guest house. But it's very nicely done. I mean, it's quite beautiful, and they saved those structures, which better than tearing them down for sure. At around this period, he really got more and more interested in the whole idea of folding and overlapping and origami. He called it origami. And he started it, he'd been experimenting with it. Are we okay? Oh yeah, we're good for time. And he got a client in Martha's Vineyard, Mike Levitas, who was an editor of the New York Times. He'd been, I think, head editor at Newsweek, and then he went over to the New York Times, became a well-known editor of the New York Times. And he'd proposed a much more radical house. I mean, it was kind of a little more like the Perlroth house. It was very sculptural. And the builder, it wasn't even the community of Martha's Vineyard. The builder said, "No, I can't build that. I'll lose all my other jobs because everybody's so conservative here. They love a good New England, a salt box, something like that." So he came back and basically said, "I'm not going to build it for you." So he came back and then went to Geller, and Geller came back with this plan, which was this sort of overlapping, almost like a kite or a sailboat with these flaps. And there's the model for it. And these kind of what he called people don't use beer can openers. I mean, we flip it off, but there used to be, when you get a can opener, it'd have one end would be kind of blunt and the other was sharp. And he kept using that as his expression for the windows and stuff. And now you have to explain what a beer can opener does to a younger generation anyway. And that's the house, yeah. And the living area and the bedrooms are incredibly narrow, So on one side you look up the hill and there's a bay on the other, and then look out to the ocean on that other side. And then again, these sort of guest rooms and whatever squirreled away in those kind of flaring dress-like shapes. And that's the happy couple flying a kite. I think this was it might have been for Life magazine or one of the big I think Look magazine. The idea was, it's a kite-like house, and here's the couple flying a kite. There you get an idea of what a wonderful perch, location it is, overlooking the rocky shore. But that's the interior. I mean, just really small and narrow, again, but looking out on both sides. The furnishing is pretty terrible. There again, there's a kite hanging from but that's, that was their taste. It's very cozy. Great project. This same year, 62 was a really bad nor'easter. Nor'easters go on usually for three days, right, or 4 days. And this one hit the island really badly. And this is Betty Reese's house. I mean, it made the New York Times. It was basically flipped off of its foundation, concrete block foundation, and ripped away. And this is a photograph taken, I think, the second day of the nor'easter. By the third day, it was gone. It was literally, out to sea. So she got some insurance and went back to Andy Geller and said, "I'm selling the property. I don't want to be in the ocean anymore." And bought a wooded lot in Bridgehampton up on a hill, well away from the water. And he did, again, his beer can kind of openings, Again, this very much barn-like interior, very open with little hanging perches and catwalks. I mean, this is the interior. It's crazy, So it's catwalk going down the middle. You can see that fanlight window at the end, which was her bedroom. And that's Andy, I think, sitting there, having a lunch party. That's her putting an American flag. This is one of my favorite photographs of Betty Reese washing the mildew off the side of her house, 10 years later. Another similar kind of Monterey's house. This was never built, but the drawing is great. Again, these gills or flaps, bring light in. Around this period, he's doing a lot of houses out here on the East End, and he gets to know George Nelson, who's also been working here. George did, the Holiday House, which I've shown in previous lectures here, and really admired he was one of the few sort of well-known architect designers who admired Geller's work and had known him from the Moscow, because he was kind of head designer at the Moscow Fair in 1959 and encouraged Geller's work. So an important ally at this point. And there he is. That's George Nelson in the middle. This is the Elkin House in Sacaponic, and that's Andy Geller on the left. I don't know who the guy, does anyone know who the guy on the right is? I do not know who that is. Again, this became very controversial, this house. And I remember when I first moved back here in the 80s, everybody was bitching about this house. And it was sort of in the middle of a potato field in Sacaponic. And then very soon after it was built, there was nothing around it in the beginning. So it was small, but it was highly noticeable. And everybody called it the reclining Picasso and all these different names. And then Marvin Kuhn, my old friend at the East Hampton Star, did this cartoon kind of based on that, because it was really the center of so much fury. And I went, well, God, it's this tiny house. Soon enough, it was surrounded by other houses, and you didn't even see it anymore. And then it was knocked down in, I think, around 2000, 2005. But I included the model and photographs in the second show I did at Guildhall in 1999. And they'll remain nameless, but some pretty heavyweight architecture dudes came, well-known, you'd know who they are. And they loved the show, and they looked around, and then they saw photographs of that and the model of it, and went, how dare you include this, in this show? He's, that's an embarrassment. It's terrible. They hated Gell. They hated the whole idea of him, because he didn't go to Princeton or Harvard or Columbia or Yale or anything. He went to Cooper, and I don't know what degree. He probably got a bachelor's in design or something, and he just wasn't part of the club. And that signaled something to me, like made me even more interested in him, that he didn't belong to the kind of elite, architectural elite. But they were really, really upset about that he had been included. So I thought, well, I did the right thing. I'm sorry, but I love architecture, but architects can be quite uptight, to put it, politely. That's another shot of it. Again, you can see there was nothing there when he did this, in these kind of funky 60s, 70s interiors, which are great. Again, you see how tiny it is, very narrow. That's the floor plan. And it kind of expands out in the living area. I'm sorry. And the same period, M again. So this house is still there. It's hard to notice it. She was a really interesting artist. And this plan that Andy came up with on the bottom there is based on some of her paintings, which were sort of these overlapping, again, folded forms that she repeated. So he took, I think that's a cool idea, that he took some of her paintings and transformed them into a plan for the house. Of course, it then was called the Cat House and everything, because it had these, kind of suggestions. But the fact that it came out of these abstract studies that she had done, I found very interesting. This is, you've probably seen this, the so-called Antler House, in Springs. And that's been very nicely restored. What are the names again? Two Street Studio did that in 2019. And it's been sold and is being restored again. I think by Andrew Pollack. I think he's got the job. I think he's already started it. So again, it'll go through another iteration, but it's very. He really brought it back to kind of its elemental geometric forms. The interiors are great. All that wood, all that knotty pine, or this might be cedar. I'm sorry, this might be cedar. The upstairs, again, a wonderful guest bedroom up in the roof, like an attic. He always said, I love attics. This was one of the houses we were searching for that day in summer of 1999. the greenhouse, and we couldn't find it, and we finally started to give up, and we went back to get some lunch, and then we tried again, and it was so surrounded. This is how it looked when it was built, quite late in '68 for him. Again, the idea was, to get as much light into the house as possible without direct sunlight. And so this idea of this overhanging roof, but with windows coming under the eaves of the roof. That's the plan for it. I mean, that's the elevation for it, I'm sorry. And that's how, again, another pretty wonderful restoration that was recently done. So it's in good shape. So when we got there, though, it was, I swear to God, it was like the classic singles weekend rental, and about 10 people were sleeping on the floors. There were like sandals and beer cans and surfboards lying around, and practically a dead body in the swimming pool. I mean, it was just, and it just smelled really bad. And so we finally found this thing, which was so great. And he was like, "Oh my God, someone needs to clean this up." But so it has been very nicely cleaned up, and now rents to just a single family instead of 20 weekenders. That's the way it looks now. It's very nicely done. So I think that's about an hour. So Andy passed away at 87 in 2011. I like that the Times, my friend Fred Bernstein wrote the obituary. Andy Geller died in Syracuse at the age of 87. The obituary described him as a design innovator who brought, quote, modernism to the masses, which I think he would have been pretty pleased with, and again, just bringing a unique kind of vision to a world that's often very highly controlled. And he just had a lot of fun, he had a lot of fun with it. So that's why I called it Architect of Happiness, because I do think he brought happiness to his clients, and I think he brought happiness to anyone who ever stops and sees his work. And I guess that's it, so. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I would love to have them, and I'll try to answer them. So if you have any thoughts or questions, or you can just talk, yeah.
Regarding Leisure-Rama, did Geller feel like a little, because that was pretty rigid in what they really had to do there, so he really wasn't going.
Yeah.
And Raymond Loewy, I think, was even.
Well, they were. It was under the Loewy, brand.
Did he feel like a little bit restricted? He couldn't really, because
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
really cookie cutter for what it was.
Totally. They built 200, and then in Fort Lauderdale they built like 800 or something. Yeah.
Plantation.
Do you know it about it, right? Yeah, clearly. Did you live in one?
No,
No.
I did research about this.
You did, yeah.
We did a podcast, and we had this episode.
Well, from what he told me, it was very much about, it was just about crunching numbers. It was about, okay, we have enough money to build 200 of these things. It was all about square footage and penny, penny to penny. And that's what Loewy was all about. And I guess they made money. They seem to have done very well. I mean, I think they made a lot of money. I don't think the Lauderdale one did as well, though. I don't know for that.
Lauderdale did better.
Oh, it did better? Yeah, yeah. Oh, so you know more than I do about it. Go ahead. Why don't you come up and give a little short? No, but I think it's fascinating. I think economically and in terms of marketing, that's what it's about. The architecture is, whatever. It's pretty much the same as a lot of subdivision, kind of stuff. But again, those houses look that way for a reason. That's what I learned over the years, trying to help get affordable housing that look kind of cool and modernist. There's a reason it doesn't look that way. It's now in Europe they seem to be able to do that because they're encouraging younger architects, and they're federally funded. There's maybe more money. I don't know why, but yeah, that's really interesting. A fascinating project. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Yes.
Could you talk about his relationship to Syracuse? Why he was there?
I have no idea why he died in Syracuse.
Why did he live in Syracuse?
He didn't. He lived in Northport, Long Island. I think it was a hospice or something. I think it was just at the end of his life.
But that's far.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to. His grandson would know, who was supposed to be here today, but he unfortunately was in the hospital. Yeah, I think he's going to be okay. I think he's okay. I wondered that myself. Yeah, I don't think there's any. I think it's just. Oh no, you know what? It's maybe his daughter is upstate New York. That's right. Yeah, it is right. Yeah. How do you know that? Yeah.
Because I met her.
Oh, you met her. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting. He's one of the few house architects that do not aspire to do larger work.
Right.
I mean, usually this is like a jumping off point to fusional projects or mega mansions. Did he
Yeah.
ever talk about?
Well, it was sort of backwards with Andy, you know, because he was doing large projects for Raymond Loewy. I mean, he was doing whole shopping centers and large buildings. Amazing, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning. There's a lot to tell about him. I didn't go into, but he did the volume shaping for the Lever House in New York, which is one of the most famous high rises in New York City, and he worked that out with with some other designers, but he was the guy in charge of figuring out the massing of that building. So he had worked on a lot of large urban, mainly suburban kind of shopping centers and town centers and things like that. But he kind of he was in that way a real artist sculptor. You know, he wanted on the weekends he wanted to go play with his thing, and he loved he had those. When I first met him in '88, was it '87? Every model was perfectly preserved. You know, he kept repairing them, and they were stacked in all of his closets and his shelves, and those were his baby. You know, those were his object. You know, very cool. Vera.
I remember, Jimmy, there was a movie being made by his grandson about him.
Yes.
What happened with it?
That's being made, and that's what was going to be shown. I was going to cut this shorter. He was going to show 20 minutes of it, but he had to have an operation. So we hope he's okay. But yes, apparently we're hoping next summer we'll be able to show the whole piece. Yeah. So his grandson is really interesting. His grandson wrote a later book about him, and Jake Gorst is his name, and he was really brought up by his grandparents, and Jake had been born in a commune, and it was like, so the grandparents kind of took over a little bit, and he just adores, he adored Andy, and that's a beautiful relationship. So the movie's very personal and very, much about family, and it's very different from. I mean, I've written about so many architects, and I never met anyone like this, and at first I thought, oh, is this not cool enough? Is this not, architectural enough, to make it? And of course, it was the one thing that people responded to the most when I did the first show, when I wrote about him in the Times and in books, that everybody wanted to know more about. And I thought I'd done this lecture really recently, or a version of it but it was after I did the book, the Gellert book, which was 2004. And then I realized, and I kept looking at my computer like, where's that lecture? Well, we've all gone through, digital, rebirth, whatever. And I was in a slide projector, oh my God. So I had to scan a lot of this stuff. I didn't, what do you do with all those slides? I still have the carousels that have the Gellert, 2 carousels. And they're cool, they're better quality images in some ways. But anyway, that's a different story. But anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can. For a second. Do we have time to mention that? Yeah.
You have another question, a couple more questions, one in the way back.
Okay.
Thank you for talking. I'm Jonathan Pollock.
Oh man. Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. Yeah. Oh, double diamond or double brassiere or square brassiere.
I should get a hand for just being the son.
I think you should.
My wife and I were the people who really made a lot of effort to restore it.
That's why we're clapping. Yeah.
I raised my hand just to give a little clip about a little insight into Andrew. It was just before they built it, my parents, and it was such an odd house with all the fishermen shot there.
Yeah.
It really did look like a spaceship. I mean, my mother used to tell me that people were like, hit the brakes,
Yeah.
So when the house was finished, my mother said to Andrew, hey, you love this, I'm sure there was someone overwhelmed, but there's no closet. There aren't any closets in the house.
Yeah.
What do? He said, who needs a closet? Bang a nail into the wall and there's your closet.
There you go. And what did your mother say to him?
I think she asked him to build a closet.
Yeah, he didn't care about that. Well, yeah, but some of his closets are pretty. I think a lot of architects don't like closets, because it's just, you got to think about it. But listen, I want to thank you personally for what you did, because I've seen what you've done. It's amazing. And not many people have been able to do that. I mean, you guys kept it in the, do you rent it out most of the time, or do you?
Well, no, it's just in summer.
Yeah.
We rent it. But, we built another structure on the.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But we really did restore it to what it was
Yeah.
in 1950, even down to the single pane glass with no functioning windows.
Right.
And then we realized it was a sauna, and so we put a few functioning windows in there. But otherwise, yeah.
Did you ever have a point where you went, "God, why are we doing this?" Because it must have been a hassle to pick it up and lift it back. No, never. Yeah. You were committed. Yeah. Yeah. Nice.
Never thought of knocking it down. We did at one point offer to donate it to the town of Southampton.
Right.
And it was supposed to become a pavilion on Hot Dog Beach, like a beach village, but it would actually
Yeah.
been moved down
Yeah.
the road on the.
I remembered that. Yeah.
And the funding got messed up.
Right.
So we just said, okay, next estimate,
Wow.
we'll keep it. And,
No, it was great what you did. It was really commendable what you did. Thank you. Thank you. Anything else? Anybody else? Yeah.
I know you covered a lot of the houses.
Yeah.
How many of them still exist in the Hamptons?
Well, that's a good question. Quite a few of the ones I showed. Yeah. And when I mentioned that, they've been restored or they're not been restored, maybe a third of what I showed has been torn down. Yeah. It's very hard. Once someone, especially if it's an oceanfront and it's, the guy paid $30 million for, and they've got this tiny 600 square foot beach house there, it's hard to convince a hedge fund dude, to lay off. But every once in a while you have, like a family or someone who's really inspired. I mean, I think they're Italian. The couple who did that, the Phil George house, the one with where they used the boardwalk concept to tie it together. They didn't know, they'd never heard of Geller, but they read my book. The architect sent them the book. And he went, yeah, no, we have to save them. And he was a very cultured European guy. He said, yeah, figure out how to work them into the plan. And it kind of shaped the plan, in fact, was how do we use these, and made it very unusual. It's a beautiful and incredible house, yeah.
Did he design his own house in Northport?
No.
Oh, okay.
And it's so typical, right? The architect live in this, creative play box, but I'm living in an old Victorian house. There's a famous movie that one of your board members, Sandy Pearlbinder, made. Did you ever see that? Called The Architect? And it's a short. I think it won an Academy Award. And it's this terrible guy, this uptight, very kind of Richard Marle type guy. And don't mention that. And he's walking around. He's telling the clients, like the closet, like you don't need a closet. Why do you need a closet? Why do you need a window here? And why do you need a bathroom? And the wife and the husband are just devastated, and they're trying to live up to this guy's incredibly high standards. And then at the end of the movie, he goes home, and it's a Victorian house. And he goes, "Honey, I'm home." And and he lived there forever, and it was this kind of mosh pit of, he was a very interesting painter too. He was a good artist, so his house was filled with paintings and models and sketches. Oh, and his wife is an amazing painter. Shirley also built, do we still have that? She made for us, after I did the book, I think, or the show. She did, yeah. And she made us a mermaid, a stuffed mermaid with little cockle shells for breasts, right? Yeah, or for a bra. Yeah, they were just charming. You wanted to hang out with them. Again, yes, hi. Oh, yes. I wasn't going to forget. I was just saying. So we're working on a feature film called Vanishing Point, the life and death of Norman Jaffe, architect. And I did the book on Norman and a show at the Parrish years ago, 2006, I think. And I'd made a short film then, and so luckily interviewed a lot of people who subsequently died. So it's going along. If anyone wants to invest in it, we would love it. We're trying to finish it. We have most of the footage. We still need a few interviews and a couple of beauty shots, and then we're going to start working with an editor and hopefully finish it by, the new year, sometime then. But the idea is to really, it's not so much about the controversy of, what happened to him. I mean, that's obviously there. We have to tell that story. But it's about a pre-digital architect, I mean, he never allowed, until the end, he didn't want any computers in his office. He drew everything by hand. Even his faxes I find fascinating, and just the culture of that period, which we all remember, most of us remember, but for a younger generation doesn't even know what that is, So, and we use, I inherited a lot of small cassette tapes of him talking. I would just go and meet with him, and he would, spiel away with these philosophical. He's a very spiritually driven guy. I mean, you've probably all seen the Jewish Center, which I think is one. The interior of that sanctuary is just transcendent. So we're trying to capture that, what it's like to be an architect, and so by the end, it's not so much like what actually happened to him in a police detective kind of sense, but more like, where was he going spiritually in this life? And he did transcend from, a real Hamptons, New York architect who worked for wealthy clients and tried to bring them some kind of revelation through light and space. And then, really found himself with the Jewish Center. But before he did the Jewish Center, he spent at least 2 trips in northern India with his guru, Sai Baba, and was very inspired by he would have these visions of these clouds that were like the hand of God, whatever. And that's the shape of the Jewish Center. I don't know if you know that kind of, it's like they call it a pork chop shape, that the columns are made from, was based on these clouds that he'd seen in India. I mean, it's kind of a wonderful story. So we're telling all that,
Did you say workshop?
Yeah, the architects who worked with, I know, isn't that ironic? Yeah, I didn't call it that, but his guys who were not Jewish called it that. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed you. No, wait a minute, one more. Yeah.
My question was first about Eller. Any of his affordable housing ideas were ever built? And just on a side note, I worked for one that got me in those last.
You did? Yeah. Oh, cool. In Bridgehampton? Yes. Yeah. What's your name? Mark. Not Mark Matthews, though.
No.
What's your last name?
Morgan Burris. I was an office assistant.
Uh-huh.
I was drafting at the time, but he wouldn't let me draft. He only let me erase.
That's very Norman. So was it like a summer internship, or were you there all year, all winter?
For 2 summers, and then took a year off from school.
Oh, will you give me your number after this? Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for that. Okay, I guess
Affordable housing. Was any other?
Yeah. Well, that's some of the stuff he did. Some of the projects he did for the Lowy Corporation were built, and the Leisure-Rama is his. I mean, now that's not. I mean, it became year-round for a lot of people. The original idea was this would be some, vacation housing for the masses, kind of. He did quite a few other projects. I don't know. I would sort of tune out when he talked about the Lowy stuff, because you could see that was not where his heart lay at all. That was just his day job. But he did one of the photographs I showed early on. He's sitting there with a cigarette, and that was a housing project that was eventually built in the Midwest somewhere. I don't know what state it is, but that was a very early version of it. It was, conceptually very interesting. It was kind of based on this mathematical formula, and it would be like a beehive, and you could expand it, as large as you wanted. So it had a good idea behind it, kind of sculptural idea behind it, but I don't think it was ever built that way. I think it ended up being pretty predictable. There is a reason those subdivisions look the way they do. It's usually economic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.